Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabarty. Today we are going to be talking a lot of NBA as last night was pretty eventful for a couple different reasons despite maybe not necessarily the biggest slate of games. So we are going to be talking about specifically the 76ers and Warriors game where there was a lot to unpack there as Joel Embiid played through an injury, had a tough game, and things got even tougher when he went down with a serious knee injury in the fourth quarter. So we will be talking about that injury and the implications on the MVP race for him. Then we're going to look at the other side of that game and talk about the Warriors, who we did just cover last week, but now that we've seen a few games of Draymond Green returning back from his injury, I wanted to touch on just the impact that he has for that organization and for his teammates, because I do think that he's obviously somebody that catches a lot of slack from, NBA fans, NBA media, and that is very much justified, but he truly is valuable to that organization, so we're going to touch on that. We are then going to talk about Jayson Tatum, who had a big game last night as well against the Pacers in a season series between them and the Pacers that has been pretty intense, has given us a lot of good basketball and has got a little heated at times, who put together a very well-rounded performance, and yet the reaction on social media was a little bit underwhelming, and I think that ties into the big scoring nights that we've had across the league. So I want to touch on that for them, and then finally we are going to finish off the show by talking about the updates around the coaching carousel in the NFL. We have a new head coaching hire. We have some people staying in places that are pretty significant, and then a couple of coordinator updates. Before we get into the show, though, just a reminder to like and follow. And for anybody on the current live stream, just remember to help get your questions in by using the tip stream at the bottom, scrolling across the ticker. That is streamelements.com/gsmcsportsnetwork./tip. So without further ado, getting into Joel Embiid here in this Sixers game versus the Warriors. Joel Embiid came into this game on the injury report with a knee injury. I specifically referenced the injury report because that was a little bit of a topic of conversation, because on Saturday night the Sixers were slated to play the Denver Nuggets. We were looking to get another Joel Embiid versus Nikola Jokic matchup, and with about 25 minutes before the game, the trainers saw something in pregame shoot-around with Embiid that they had flagged as concerning. So they pulled him out of that game. He was a late game scratch for that one. Did not play. And then he went on to miss the game 2 nights ago against the Portland Trailblazers. So last night he comes into this game. He's on the injury report. He is cleared to play. And it was clear from the very beginning that he was struggling physically. He was limping significantly. He had to go to the locker room after playing about 10 minutes early on in that one with a wrap around his knee, but he came back out and he toughed it out for a lot of the game, despite all of us sort of watching that game and seeing that something was not right with him. There was a point in the first half where he just sort of took a little bit of a jog forward and his knee just gave out on him and he ended up hitting the floor, no contact or anything. And that's when I was really starting to get concerned. And he ended up playing through most of the game, but he wasn't really playing like himself. This was a version of Embiid that it's not even totally fair to say that it was sort of like the younger Embiid, but he was not looking to be anywhere near as aggressive as we have seen him in the past few months as he's been putting together this MVP campaign. He was struggling with mobility. He was settling for lazy outside shots. When he was going inside, he was seemed so focused on himself that a lot of the problems that he had early on in his career, as far as not being able to pass out of double teams, not sensing the double teams, he was just getting ransacked. He finished with a really bad stat line, played 30 minutes, had 14 points, 7 rebounds, and 8 turnovers. And just out of curiosity, I sort of dove into this a little bit, just asking myself, when was the last time we've seen Joel Embiid play this poorly? And using the game score statistic, this is a stat that you can find. It basically just weighs the different box score statistics and values different categories with a different value, adds them all together, and spits out a game score. This is not a perfect system, obviously. It's about the, most sophisticated almost box score watching stat that there is. So again, it is definitely flawed, but it is at least a rough estimate into giving sort of what kind of a production a player had in a game. And Embiid finished with a game score of minus 0.7. which is far and away the worst game that he's had this season. That includes last season as well. The lowest he had was something like 8 points, and then might have even been 10 points. I was looking through the past 3 seasons. This was the worst game score that he has had since May of 2021. So he was very bad. The Warriors end up losing this game. They were really trying to force him through this, even in the fourth quarter, despite some of their bench minutes actually being more productive. But Joel Embiid was determined to play in this game, and as to why that is, we'll sort of get into a little bit more through this segment. But the 76ers have now lost 4 straight games. Now, Tyrese Maxey, their likely all-star guard, has missed the past 2 with an ankle injury, so that's obviously been a part of it. No Embiid or Maxey against Portland last night, the first half of a back-to-back, and they got steamrolled in that one. They were in this game for a while, but obviously fall short. So in terms of the specific 4-game losing skid, pushing them back down to the 5th seed in the East, I would say that it is not panic mode whatsoever, really. These types of things happen. I feel like in the NBA especially, things can get a little bit weird leading up to the All-Star break, which we will be taking place now in, I think, 2 weekends. I believe it's the weekend after the Super Bowl. So, that can happen. It's, middle of the season. You're now halfway through, but not quite at the break. Things can get weird, but this could be panic mode depending on what happens with the MRIs. We're still waiting on that because Joel Embiid, he late in that fourth quarter went down with a more serious knee injury, and he did not return. Nick Nurse, after the game, said that this was actually unrelated to the knee injury that he came into the game on the injury report with. So, again, I think that there's a lot of stuff going on with this whole injury situation, especially considering a lot of this has become about Embiid's MVP race, and even more so than that, just the amount of scrutiny that he has been receiving. Now, I think that at times it can be justified. I mean, sports fandom, feel like as a whole, and the NBA takes it to the next level. The level of toxicity within fan bases and the fans of the sport as a whole, there's just nothing like it. And I think that especially following Joel Embiid missing the Denver Nuggets game this past weekend, so many people were on his case. There was all this talk, and now, fair or not, he has not played in Denver since 2019. He's missed the past handful of matchups there. This season, there have been a good amount of instances where he would sit out games, again, whether it was a true injury or not, but facts are facts. He would miss a handful of games against the upper echelon teams in the league and then return to score 40 points against the Washington Wizards or, these bottom feeder teams. Sorry, any Wizards fans out there, but you and I both know it. And I think that, again, it's definitely partially unfair because all of these people that are criticizing him, first off, none of them are 7'2", 7'3", are these massive human beings that deal with day-to-day pains that we couldn't even imagine having to push ourselves through because we've never been in that position. And again, you're asking yourself to physically put yourself on the line for these games that, they are regular season games, and I definitely don't want to diminish the importance of showing up if you're healthy, because the NBA as a whole, the whole reason this 65-game minimum for NBA awards came into place because the regular season was viewed as a joke by a lot of people. And I think that the initiative to correct that is definitely in the right place when it comes to the intent. But then it sort of just additionally gives NBA fans this fuel to come down even harder on guys when they do miss games. And for a player like Joel Embiid, who missed the first couple seasons of his career with a foot injury at his enormous size, we all see the talent there. Injuries have plagued him his entire career, quite literally from day one. I think going into that draft process, it was a well-known thing that he would not be able to play. Now, talking about a decade ago, I'm trying to remember if I'm confusing that with him or Nerlens Noel, the pre-draft. They're likely not going to be able to play. But that is sort of where this whole trust the process thing came from. And Joel Embiid, unlike a bunch of those other mid-2010s draft picks for the 76ers, came out and he emerged as an all-time talent and MVP. So now, fast forward to this season, obviously, he's been under so much fire and people are questioning his character. There was a reporter at the Denver-Philadelphia game last week that asked Nick Nurse whether or not the fact that Joel Embiid missed that game speaks to his character. And it's a little bit of a crazy concept to me, just because it's not even a crazy concept because I can understand where it comes from, but at the same time, we've never been in this same position, and you're asking somebody to risk further injury just for the sake of saying that they showed up to the game and that they didn't run from the competition. We're talking about regular season games here, which, again, I think should be taken more seriously, but at the jeopardy of missing playoff games when everybody knows that that's the other part of Joel Embiid's whole legacy here, is the fact that he hasn't fully been able to show up to these playoff series quite as effectively as he has the regular season. So he knows that he has to prove himself there. All of us as NBA fans know that there is a level of he has to prove himself in the playoffs. But even in the playoffs, injuries have been a huge concern with him and have deteriorated the product that we could potentially be getting from Embiid in this situation. So I wanted to talk a little bit, again, just to wrap up the Embiid specific injury. We're waiting on MRIs. So you have to hope that it's not serious, but it definitely didn't look good. And I always do sort of worry a little bit about the coming up with another injury, the compensation injury, I should say, of you're trying to battle through one thing, and as a result, you put strain on another muscle even worse, and it ends up being a more serious injury. Hopefully that's not the case. We will obviously keep you updated with that. But on the note of the 65 game minimum rule, this is, as we've talked about on the show in the past, this is a brand new rule this year where you have to play at least 65 games to be eligible for MVP, Defensive Player of the Year, Rookie of the Year, any of the yearly awards, as well as the All-NBA awards. So Embiid has missed 12 games this season. In order to hit 65 game minimum, you can only miss 17 games. So only 5 more for him to be ineligible. And if you look at this, he's probably going to miss, I would guess, with this injury alone, 5 games is very possible. Plus, that means he would have to play all the rest of this season, which I think is maybe a little unrealistic, which means that he will, in my opinion, as of today, likely not make any of the All-NBA awards. And MVP is one thing. I think that there should be a higher threshold for MVP having to be there. Now, this is a stat that we talked about last week, is the fact that there's only been one player in NBA history in a full 82 game season to play less than 65 games and win the award. That was Bill Walton in 1978. So in the past, voters have put stock into this sort of imaginary threshold anyways for games played. Now he might not even be eligible for All-NBA. I obviously have not been alive and present for the entire history of the All-NBA award, but in my opinion, I think it should help sort of tell the story of how the season went. I think it should be about, obviously, the best performing players on the best performing teams, and I think that it should be able to give us a little bit of a look in at what was the most captivating storylines during the season, and not just storylines, but greatness. And now, because of this memorable season for Embiid where he just scored 70 points, and yes, I know we've seen another bunch of other huge scoring performances as well, so maybe it gets watered down a little bit. That's what we will be talking about a little more as the show goes on. But for Embiid to not be included in any of this, and we still don't know what the injury update is, but let's say he plays 55 to 60 games, I think that would be a travesty. Now, briefly, before we wrap up this segment, I think it's also worth noting Tyrese Halliburton, the Indiana Pacers guard, is also sort of on a similar track. He has dealt with a lot of injuries, hasn't dealt with the scrutiny necessarily because they've been major injuries that have popped up. And he doesn't have a history of injuries or anything. So, well, last year he missed a lot of games, but my point being that he doesn't get really pushed to the limits like Embiid does, but he's actually missed more games than Embiid has this season. He's missed 13. He's going to be an all-star starter, and I think that he's another one that is very much in jeopardy of not being able to be selected to the All-NBA team, and I think that is a mistake. And ultimately, some people care about the record books more than others. I just think, sort of at face value, I'm not looking from the historical standpoint, but just right now, what do I think is fair? Again, we'll have to see how many games these guys play down the stretch, but I do think that they should be eligible because it wouldn't fully be encapsulating what the story of the season is if they play, say, 63 games instead of 65. I think the voters should have the know-abouts, really, to consciously take into consideration games played, but I thought that it was interesting that Draymond Green, who we will be talking about on the other half of this segment, Draymond talked about how he thinks that the rule is BS, and he lost a Defensive Player of the Year award to a Kawhi Leonard who played something like 51 games, is at least what he said on his podcast. So there's obviously a lot of different perspectives to take in mind when it comes to all of this, but I think that it's gotten messy. And while I do like the idea behind the concept, and I think that the NBA was trying to actively improve their product, it has led to a little bit of controversy. And I think that it becomes a little more weighted when you also consider the fact that so many of these NBA players' contracts are tied to incentives such as making all NBA teams and stuff like that. So it just becomes more complicated than just a fun who is being selected to all NBA teams. So that is all we have time for on this segment. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back on the other side, we will be talking about none other than Draymond Green, who has since returned from suspension, and in my opinion, he's been putting on a little bit of a show. So we will be right back. Stick with us.
Be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up in the basement. Statement. The top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place. All this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it. The noose it fits. Some moosey shit. A stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose your gift. Oh. Feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We just wrapped up talking about Joel Embiid, his injury, and the 65-game minimum for these All-NBA awards. Now, a certain player on the other side of this 76ers-Warriors game that just took place last night sort of chimed into the issue as well. That would be none other than Draymond Green. And just sort of to tie these two ideas in a little bit, he was actively on the court against Joel Embiid, and he talked about how he saw Embiid forcing himself through this injury, and that if it weren't for these rules, and of course pride takes a little bit of a role in this as well, considering the fact of how much scrutiny Embiid has been receiving through the past week or so. Specifically, I mean, it's been all season, but specifically since Saturday night when he missed that game against the Nuggets, it has been a lot of backlash for him, for a guy who has just been injured. And I know that it's so easy for us on our couches to be like, you should be playing that game, but would we really rather see Embiid force himself through an injury for some of these regular season games, or would we rather see him performing in the playoffs? As a Celtics fan, I would maybe rather not see him in the playoffs to make my favorite team's route easier. But as basketball fans as a whole, we should obviously all want Embiid to show up in the playoffs. And Draymond Green sort of touched on this on his podcast as well. But sort of shifting to Draymond Green here, I talked about the Warriors last week after their close loss on Thursday night to the Sacramento Kings. I asked the question, is this Warriors core past the point of contention? And the consensus I sort of landed on is yes, because in my opinion, if Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, and Draymond Green in the year 2024 are your three best players, I don't know that you have a championship team anymore, just by the way that the league has gotten so much better. And I mean, specifically Klay, and it sucks because Klay Thompson, he's an unbelievable personality. He seems like everybody that comes in contact with him loves him. He's just not the same version. He suffered 2 catastrophic injuries that kept him out for a couple seasons. And while any progress that he's made towards coming back is a positive, and on some nights he shows up and he's the Klay that we watched during the dynasty years for the Warriors, on a night-to-night basis, he is not the same. He is nowhere near the same defensively. I think that people forget that, yes, it's the shooting with him, but he was so good on defense during those prime Warriors years, and he's just not that anymore. They won the title, obviously, in 2022, but that's because they had Andrew Wiggins emerge, and he was phenomenal for them on both sides. He was an all-world defender, shutting down Jayson Tatum in that finals, and he was an all-star starter that season. He was so good, and now he can't shoot. Again, he was solid last night. He's fine, and maybe the thing is, when you look at those 4, you can't help but feel a little bit that there's a chance that they could turn this thing around if all of their individual players raise their play and return to the versions that we have seen in the past. I don't know if they can do that for 4 straight series, a month of basketball being that night in, night out team that we saw a couple of seasons ago. I talked about the fact as well that I thought that they were in a tough position based off of the fact that obviously Steph Curry is still Steph Curry, but they're paying all of this money to Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, and Andrew Wiggins. And Klay isn't expiring, so he's a little bit more flexible. Not that I think that they would trade him based off of just the history behind that. I think that at this point he's a little bit of a statue guy, for lack of a better term, somebody that he has been such an important pillar of this team for a decade now, that to ship him off, I don't think that that would totally feel right, and I don't think that they would do it. Even though their general manager, Mike Dunleavy Jr., did just step in for Bob Myers, so it's not like it's the same GM that's been with them through this whole run, but you get the point. I think that it would be pretty unexpected in my eyes for them to move him. Draymond Green, they just signed to a new contract for $100 million over 4 years this offseason, and Andrew Wiggins still has a few years left on his contract. He has a player option in a couple years that'll bump up to $30 million, and he at this point is probably more of a negative asset than anything. Can he turn himself around? It's still maybe very possible. We don't really have the answers as to what was happening with him last season when he missed all of those games for personal reasons. So maybe there's some sort of a mental block. We saw maybe a little bit, this is probably a little bit of an unfair statement, but I think that he elevated his game, if I can try and spin it in a more positive light. He wasn't the full version of himself in Minnesota because he didn't have the exterior factors to help make him want to put in the work, and it sort of put in some negative reinforcement energies from the Timberwolves, who never had a great culture themselves. And I think that once he went to the Warriors, he was really able to elevate his game because of the fact that he had the likes of a Steph Curry and a Draymond Green to sort of take his game to that next level and be the impact starter that he was for the finals run. Now, to get back to Draymond in all of this, I think that he has been extremely valuable for the Warriors since coming back from the suspension. he was on a minutes restriction early, obviously, because he missed as much time as he did. But since then, he has sort of elevated that. They actually removed the minutes restrictions from him during that Lakers game, and he was extremely impactful. And I've never been a fan of plus minus necessarily. I think it's a little bit of a reductive stat. It obviously has a lot to do with the other players that are on the court with you, but he has been a plus 83 in the last 5 games that he's played since returning from his suspension. And this is a plus 83 in a stretch where the Warriors have been 2-3. So it's not even like they're winning these games significantly. He was a plus 31 in a loss to the Lakers. I think he's been so impactful on both sides of the ball. Defense is sort of a given with him, the way that he can impact the game. But I think especially too, what flies under the radar a little bit with him is the playmaking. He's averaging 7 assists per game. He has multiple games with 11 assists in this span. And I think that part of his other addition to this team is the fact that he and Steph Curry just have this chemistry and connection that makes Steph Curry such an effective player. And Steph Curry, it doesn't take a lot necessarily for him to have to be an effective player. That's just who he is individually anyways. But I think that Draymond, with some of the stuff that he does off the ball and the understanding that the two of them have with one another, just makes him that much better. Steph Curry, 3 straight games with 30 points for him. And I know that, again, this is Steph Curry. He's averaging 27.5 on the season, so it's not like this is some outlandish mark for him by any means. But I think that it's just the impact and the level of winning that he brings is so big for this Warriors team. And I think that if you sort of look at the idea of the Warriors trying to reconcile some of this season as they currently sit sub 500, currently the 12th seed in the Western Conference, they have a little bit of makeup ground to cover in order to even get to the play-in tournament. And that's where, again, you're talking about you have room to make up to get to the play-in, and you expect this team to be a contender. I don't really, but I do think that it's something that we as NBA fans kind of have to acknowledge a little bit what's going on with Draymond, because there's a reason this guy's going to be in the Hall of Fame. I know that his box score stats don't always jump out at you, but he has been such an important piece of this Warriors dynasty, and you can see the difference from when he's on the court versus when he's off the court. And I think that as much as we can criticize him, we do also need to take those moments every once in a while and appreciate. I know his greatness looks very different from the greatness of a Luka Doncic scoring 73 points or a LeBron James on Saturday night against them going 20 points, 20 rebounds with a handful of assists as well. I think he had a 20-20 triple-double with that as well. Just ridiculous stuff. But greatness comes in different forms. And in today's NBA, it's obviously so offensive-oriented, shot-making-oriented, but there's more to it. And that's why he is going to be a Hall of Famer. I've never been the biggest Draymond Green fan in my life, really. He's come and gone with me, I think, at times. There was that stage where kicking LeBron James and getting himself suspended in the finals, that's an incredibly infuriating moment for me. And then, I think he was sort of coming along, but then he also pushes a Kevin Durant out of the building, which again, selfishly as a Celtics fan, and I think most NBA fans were probably like, thank you, Kevin Durant is no longer on the Warriors. We can finally have some parity again. But it's kind of a boneheaded move, to be honest, to push away one of the greatest scorers of all time off your team for whatever reasons behind the scenes that was for him. And then he sort of little brothered my Celtics in the 2022 finals. He made it clear that they weren't mentally ready for the moment, which was true in the moment, but I personally didn't really care for it because, I was rooting for the Celtics. So I think that all in all, I'm saying a lot right now and giving Draymond this praise that I don't even know if it's totally warranted, because I can't tell what the public perception of Draymond Green is as far as how great of a player all time is he. Now, again, sort of just to wrap up this segment, linking it back to the Warriors and is this team past the point of contention, I think that they probably are. And I don't think they're going to be making any moves, but could Draymond be an impact guy on a winning team somewhere else? I don't think the Warriors are going to be selling off. I think that he could very much be an impact guy on a Sacramento Kings, a team that hasn't really had a ton of playoff experience other than last year going to Game 7 against the Warriors themselves. But, you look at the teams that were interested in him in free agency, it was reportedly the Kings, the Trailblazers, and the Pistons. Draymond does nothing, I don't think, except for you can make the mental edge argument, but I think Draymond would just be fed up trying to play with that Pistons team. Would they be better for it today? Definitely. But I don't think that he would be happy with it, and I don't think that the Pistons should be giving up assets to be trying to get him. So could a Sacramento trade for him? Could a Lakers trade for him? I don't love the Lakers fit because they already struggle with shooting as it is, but their defense hasn't been great as of late anyways as well. So I think that he's staying put on the Warriors, but he is just such an interesting and unique case, I think, in the NBA today. So we are going to be taking another break. When I come back on the other side, we just talked about the different forms of greatness. Going to continue that conversation a little bit, talking about Jayson Tatum and the Celtics and why his greatness a lot of the time looks different in a team environment than the individual high-scoring performances. So we will be taking a quick break. Stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We just finished up talking about Draymond Green and his impact on the Warriors. I wanted to sort of switch gears a little bit, still sticking with the NBA, but I thought that the overall aftermath of Jayson Tatum and the Celtics win last night was perceived in a very interesting light, and I sort of wanted to talk about that. We've been doing a lot of NBA fan discourse throughout the course of the show today, and we're going to be sticking with that theme a little bit going through with this segment. Last night, the Boston Celtics beat the Indiana Pacers in a very high-scoring game. They had control for a while, but third-quarter struggles continued to sort of surround the Celtics, and they let this become a game. Ended up being a tie game, and down the stretch, it took a level of maturity for the Celtics that we haven't always seen with this core to be able to pull out this game. And even in the end, I still thought that it was closer than it should have been, because I feel like, and this is coming from a Celtics fan, right? But I think that when you look at the Celtics starting five and even some of their bench players, there isn't much liabilities on the defensive end. Whereas you look at a young team like the Pacers, who, yes, they're trying to build things. They're just acquiring. They just acquired Pascal Siakam a couple weeks ago, and they're trying to establish themselves as one of these, next age contenders. Probably not this year, but they're making the jump this year. Next year, can they be taken a little bit more seriously? They have a lot of liabilities on the defensive end, and I would prefer the Celtics to sort of attack those liabilities, but they don't necessarily, and that's because I do think that there is a level of this team at times is oversharing, and their assist numbers aren't great, so I don't know if that's necessarily going to be supported by some of the statistics, but I think that starters 1 through 5 are all key contributors for this Celtics team. Last night, their starters, Jayson Tatum led the way, 30 points, 7 rebounds, 7 assists, shot 12 of 19 from the floor. And then we have Siri going off on my watch right now, but we also had Jaylen Brown scoring 25 points, Derek White with 24, Drew Holiday adding 17, and Kristaps Porzingis with 17 as well. So you have a very high level starting lineup in the NBA. I think that most people, a lot of people at least, would argue that it is the best starting 5 in the league. The Denver Nuggets obviously have a very strong argument as well. The Sixers, when they're at their peak, are a pretty good group as well. But I think that the two-sided abilities of every single player on this group is just flat out amazing. And I think that we are so desensitized. So the reason I get into this conversation, right, is because I see a post on social media talking about Jayson Tatum scores 30 points, 7 rebounds, 7 assists, this good 12 of 19 shooting performance from the field. It's his 18th 30-point game. And the comment section just talking about, oh, so we're rewarding anybody for scoring 30 points now. As if 30 points wasn't a huge feat just even 10 years ago before this three-point shooting mirage. 30 points was seen as a very good game, and it is a very good game, and it still should be seen that way. I agree that scoring is more prominent, but I think that people also in this whole defenses just stink now, I think that people also forget about the fact that the pace is just so much higher than it ever was, so teams and players are shooting far more shots than they used to. Three-pointers obviously add to higher scoring performances, and obviously this type of a day from Jayson Tatum isn't the same as Luka Doncic's 73 points. And anytime any player scores, call it even 40, 50 points, I am a little bit enamored. I want to see how are they getting this done, what is going into this performance that allows you to, despite having 4 other guys on the court with you offensively, that you are still able to get into the defense and get hot like this, lifting your team. And it just doesn't seem like, because of all of these scoring performances that we've had, especially in recent history, people just kind of discredit players for playing a team game, because that's what it is, and that's what I think that the best players in the world do. You take LeBron James. He's, of course, had his huge scoring nights, but what made him special all of these years was the fact that he could probably get to the rim 50 times a game and put up unbelievable numbers. Kevin Durant's another one where you'd be surprised by, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but his career high I don't think is the same level as some of these now Embiid and Luka Doncic's. And I think that you look at the way that NBA fans view the game, and I swear they almost don't even enjoy it anymore, just the way that they talk about it. The expectations from individual stat numbers are just so much higher, and I understand not everybody has the time to actually watch every single game, but it all lies in the box score now. And 7 assists is solid to go along with a very efficient 30-point scoring night. So I guess my point in all of this is Jayson Tatum, I don't think, gets enough credit for the way that he's been able to develop over the years, because he hasn't necessarily had some of these extremely high scoring nights. He still has multiple 50-point games in his career, but I don't think that a player should be judged solely based off of what their career high is. I think that that's something that Tatum maybe focused on a little bit more earlier in his career, but now at this point, this Celtics team, who just lost in the 2022 finals, and like we talked about in the last segment, sort of got a little bit embarrassed in their way to it, because the other team and their emotional leader, Draymond Green, just put it on display just how lack of prepared and mental toughness that this team had at the time. And I think that in turn, the Celtics have rebounded. I know that last year was a little bit weird. I think that people also overlook the fact of people like regular NBA fans, I don't think also fully understand the extent that coaching does matter. Now, I would far and away argue that the talent level on the roster in the NBA is far more important than the talent level in the NFL, where a coach can help scheme you to more wins. It's hard to just scheme up wins in the NBA, where there's only 5 players on the court at a time, and it is so skill-based. The sport is, I would say, like, yes, there are, but like, that's the thing, is I think that coaching does matter more than the typical NBA fan would like to admit. And last year, the Celtics had a huge scandal with their first-year head coach that had just taken them to the finals. The regular coaching cycle went through. And then a couple months later, this scandal with Ime Udoka takes place, and they have to hire Joe Mazzulla because their lead assistant, Will Hardy, who's been a great coach for the Utah Jazz, he is signed. He brings some of his guys with him, and it was just such a depleted coaching staff that I think sort of helped lead to, especially when you come up against a Miami Heat team that is just about the most well-coached. I know they're going through a crazy skid right now. I don't know how I even feel about the Heat at this point, because like, it looks terrible right now. I'm still terrified of them as a Celtics fan, so weird thing there. But when the Heat are throwing this zone at you and your coach is completely unable to sort of overcome these different looks, it can be very difficult for being a player that is 25, 26 years old to be able to lead the team and almost coach on the fly, which is what they were doing last year. And then I think Mazzulla deserves a ton of credit for the improvement that he has made this year, where last year it was Marcus Smart and Al Horford running the huddles, and this year Mazzulla can actually get his voice in, and in turn, I think that his players, led by Jayson Tatum, has just such a better understanding for the game as a whole, and for knowing how important it is, especially in these middling months in the regular season, that it is to make sure that everybody is involved. This team talked about coming into the year, there are going to have to be sacrifices from all of our starters, and last year Al Horford was a starter coming into the year. There was a lot of this talk where Al Horford is the 6th starter, and that's still sort of the case, because whenever Kristaps Porzingis misses a game, or they have one of their starting lineups, their guys in their starting lineup miss a game, it's typically Al Horford stepping in. But this team talked so much about sacrifice and being willing to work together in sorts, and that's what they've done. And so you see all of these well-rounded performances, and obviously there's the portion of NBA Twitter and such that just wants to sort of be reductive and put it all on the shoulders of whoever the star player is. But that hasn't really been the case, I think, for the Celtics team, where Jayson Tatum is absolutely the most valuable player on the team. But from there, I think you can make an argument legitimately for there being three different guys that is the second most valuable player. Some will argue Jaylen Brown. He's the highest paid contract in the league. He's their scorer. He's been with the team just about the longest tenured Celtic now, I think, at this point. Some people will argue Kristaps Porzingis, the total X factor, adds this entirely different dynamic to their offense and to their defense as well. And then Derek White, who's just the ultimate glue guy. It's very clear when they miss him. It's clear when they miss Porzingis, and it's clear when they miss Brown too. That's just the thing about the way that the Celtics team is built. It is an actual team. And people want to almost hold it against Tatum, and really, I think that it's Tatum that gets the short end of the stick. And the thing is I'm making this whole argument based off of winning is ultimately the most important thing in the NBA. And I think that Jayson Tatum knows that himself. But that means that in order to sort of overcome those, the critics, I should say, is by winning the finals. And they have the best chance that they have up to this point in their career. They have, in my opinion, at least a top 2 most talented team in the league. And winning is going to be the only thing that solves the critics. And every player in the league, really other than Jokic right now, because of recency bias in last year, and I'm not saying that he should have critics, every NBA star in the league has critics. I think that it's been incredibly interesting for me lately to look at the way that different fan bases all come after other really good players. Like, I'm on Celtics Twitter a lot of the time. The way that they talk about Luka Doncic, I think, is just absurd. It sounds so uneducated. And I'm saying this to Celtics fans. Luka Doncic is amazing at basketball. And if you watch, you will see the arguments of he is just a solo player and you can't really pair him with anybody else. I don't think that that's right. Now, you can fit that storyline in because he hasn't won a finals yet. But that's just the thing, is I feel like so many people are so oriented just on championships. And while that is the ultimate goal, there's only one championship to go around per year. So you have Jokic winning it last year. You have Steph Curry the year before. You have Giannis the year before that. It is all of these great players trying to share this one opportunity to be called a champion. And it's just not that simple. Jayson Tatum has been in the conference finals just about every year of his career. There was the year they lost to the Bucks in the second round, and they lost in 5 to the Nets. And quickly, as we are wrapping up this segment, one of Jayson Tatum's best single-handed performances of his career was in that Nets series that they lost in 5 games, where they didn't have Jaylen Brown. They were extremely injured at the time, and Tatum put together a 50-point playoff game because he had to. But that doesn't even stand out as really one of it doesn't stand out for what makes him great, because it's been so much more team-oriented and the winning as a whole. Nobody really cares about a first-round, really good scoring performance. If Michael Jordan never went on to win all of his finals, the massive game that he had against Larry Bird and that Celtics dynasty early in MJ's career, we wouldn't really care about that game as much. It would just be a little bit of a moment. But instead, because he won those finals eventually, it went on to show that Michael Jordan was the greatest of all time, and he showed it against the dynasty early in his career. Jayson Tatum put up 50 points against one of the greatest scorers of all time, and I don't think that that's even a top 3 moment for him in his career. So we are going to be taking one last final break. When we come back on the other side, we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to be talking about the NFL. We have some breaking news on the coaching front, and so we're going to be talking about all of the coaching updates as of today. So stick with us for our last segment. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We just finished up talking about a whole different bunch of NBA topics, all kind of pertaining to the different ways that NBA fans view the game. We talked about Joel Embiid, 65 game minimum, and the MVP chase for him. We talked about Draymond Green and his impact, and we just finished up talking about the Boston Celtics and the team-oriented game that they play. Now we are going to be switching off to the NFL here as we are recording this on January 31st. We just had some breaking news this morning, about not even an hour before the show started, that Seattle has just named the Ravens defensive coordinator from the past couple of years, Mike Macdonald, to be their next head coach. Mike Macdonald becomes the youngest head coach in the NFL in his late 30s. He has spent a lot of time under John Harbaugh through his career. He's been with the Ravens organization since 2014, but he did briefly have a one-year stint as the defensive coordinator for Jim Harbaugh and the Michigan Wolverines. But he has been the full-time defensive coordinator for the Ravens the past 2 years, and he has done an incredible job leading them to the number one scoring defense in the NFL this season, and that defense pretty much doing everything that they could, for the most part, against a talent of Patrick Mahomes to give their offense a chance to advance them to the Super Bowl. They obviously fall short, and it's a little disappointing, but Macdonald gets to have his next move. I like the move. Yes, very young, obviously, for a head coach, but that's sort of the direction the NFL is heading in a little bit. And I think that Seattle has definitely struggled on the defensive end the past couple seasons. Now, they improved some this year, part of which they have a good amount of young talent on that defense, mixed with some veterans as well. But you bring in Devin Witherspoon for his rookie year. Boye Mafe in his second season made a jump. Rick Woolen actually sort of dropped off a bit, but he was almost neck and neck with Sauce Gardner as far as rookie cornerbacks last season. And you think that there's definitely still a lot of potential there with Rick Woolen, that he can bounce back. They have some vets, such as trading for Leonard Williams during the season this year. They have Bobby Wagner, who is currently expected to be back for next year. Quandre Diggs as well. So definitely a lot of talent on that defensive side of the ball for a team that's been underachieving somewhat on that side of the ball. So I think that this is a good hiring. This leaves just the Washington Commanders as the only team without a head coach currently. And they were heavily linked to Lions offensive coordinator Ben Johnson for a long time. Ben Johnson took some interviews, but announced yesterday, informed the teams, I should say, that he plans to remain with the Detroit Lions, and his priority is winning a Super Bowl with them. So I know that it has been a tough fallout and aftermath for a lot of Lions fans, but I think that this is very big news for them. I think that it's also very interesting considering just the idea here. Jared Goff, I think, has become a very good quarterback in the league. Now, he is likely about to get a contract extension. He's going into his final season on his contract, and I think that it would be, I could understand it for the sort of logistics of the talent and everything, and maybe still having some questions with Goff, but his number one wide receiver, Amon-Ra St. Brown, is entering the final year of his rookie deal. I think that it could definitely disrupt the locker room if you extend St. Brown, but not Jared Goff. So, I mean, we'll see how this plays out. I think Jared Goff is going to be back, and I think that having Ben Johnson with him for another year is sort of big to continue to build up this momentum. And I'm sure that Ben Johnson is going to become a head coach at some point in his career. I think that he can help get this other run at a Super Bowl with the Lions next year, and he can sort of help bring along this offense and everything and sort of set them up nicely for the years to come as well. If you're Ben Johnson in this situation, I don't really blame you for not wanting the Seattle or Washington jobs over staying there in Detroit. I think that they have a really good thing going on there. And Seattle, like I just said with McDonald, I don't think it's a bad job necessarily, but there's a lot less stability. Their quarterback is Geno Smith. He did not look the same this year, and I think that there's a quarterback with the quarterback question and with a lot of weird stuff going on, a little bit aging core in different parts, not a great offensive line, and this is a team that he probably could help rebuild. I don't blame him for wanting to stay with the Lions. Washington is also a mess. I mean, yes, they have the draft capital this year, at least to maybe go get the likes of a Drake May, a Jaden Daniels, and potentially, if they want to, trade up for Caleb Williams. But I think that all in all, this is a good move for him to just, he's still also very young in his 30s, just wait it out, come around next year. I think that between the Cowboys, between the Bills, the Steelers maybe, there are a bunch of very interesting opportunities that could become available next year. So I like this decision on his end. I can understand it, at least getting to some of these other hires that have taken place and just an update on the coordinators around the NFL. The Eagles cleaned house a couple weeks ago, letting go of both their offensive and defensive coordinators. They come in my opinion, make some upgrades on that side of the ball, where they hire Kellen Moore as the offensive coordinator. He spent his first few years with the Dallas Cowboys, sort of lost play calling duties there, went to the LA Chargers, where they were obviously a very flawed team, and you can partially blame Kellen Moore. He was, in fact, a part of that playoff collapse last year. So some questions there, but I think that it's a fine hire. The Eagles clearly needed to change things up, and I know that refusal of the run game was sort of a thing with him in LA, but I think that the Philadelphia Eagles are obviously more talented in that run game, that ideally he should learn from his mistakes and improve upon that. Defensive coordinator, I think, was the home run hire for them, though. Vic Fangio, I was very surprised when Fangio and the Miami Dolphins parted ways last season after his first season as the defensive coordinator of the Dolphins. I thought he did a pretty good job considering the injuries that they were forced to deal with. Jalen Phillips missed most of the season for them, and then down the stretch they had Bradley Chubb and Andrew Van Ginkel out as well. They had hardly any edge rushers at all. They were forcing a much older Melvin Ingram to be their do-it-all guy. He was dropping back in coverage. He was rushing. He's 34, 35 years old now, and yes, obviously very talented, and I'm not trying to take a shot at Melvin Ingram, but the defense as a whole was just so deteriorated that they didn't really stand all too much of a chance, I thought, come the playoffs. I thought that it was also interesting reading up on why the split between Vic Fangio and the Dolphins happened, and there was definitely a disconnect between him and the players in terms of work ethic and such. He wanted to part ways with them because he didn't think that they worked hard enough, and in turn, when the players found out that Fangio was gone, they were reportedly very excited to have him gone. And I think that there's definitely a discrepancy between the type of locker room that the Miami Dolphins have built up versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Mike McDaniel is a phenomenal coach. I think that he is an offensive mastermind, and he is the definition of a player's coach. He seems very laid back. We're not behind the scenes with them, but I can understand definitely seeing a difference in energy level between him and Vic Fangio. Fangio moving to Philadelphia under Nick Sirianni, who seems like his pants are on fire half the time. He's just always at 100%. He is letting the emotions fly. I think that, especially with that group that, yes, they were underwhelming this year. They had a lot of turnover with their linebackers and in their front seven as a whole, really. I think that Fangio can sort of help resurrect that, be a lot more on top of things. I mean, last year was a disaster for the Eagles on the defensive side of the ball. They changed defensive play callers halfway through the year after a 10-1 start. And not only that, but they changed it to Matt Patricia. Never want to do that. When Matt Patricia is your upgrade, you know that you are probably not in a very good position. So they make the change to Vic Fangio. I really like this hire. Now, quickly, just to wrap up the Eagles here, a lot of change for sure. This is the second consecutive season they have a new offensive and defensive coordinator, but I think that they upgraded both times this year as opposed to last year where they lost their coordinators to head coaching opportunities, and now they get some new talent in the room for them. The last move that I have, assuming time-wise it works out, is Arthur Smith was hired as offensive coordinator to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Smith was fired by the Atlanta Falcons. He was their head coach the past few seasons after a pretty miserable stretch, to be honest. But I don't seem to hate this move quite as much as other people do. I know that last year was very bad for them, and I thought that he was very bad in trying to handle the quarterback situation. He kept juggling between whether or not Desmond Ridder was their starting quarterback or if it was Taylor Heineke, and he was just sort of contradicting himself throughout the run, saying, oh, well, this guy gives us the best chance to win, and then he flipped to the other guy, and it was a mess there. He had clearly lost the locker room, and at that point he was just sort of doing whatever he could to try and salvage his job, which at that point was kind of unsalvageable. But I thought that he did a really good job during his tenure in Tennessee. He led them to 3 playoff appearances, a number 1 seed at one time. They actually didn't win any playoff games that year, but they did also win they made their way to the AFC Championship game in a different year. And this was with Ryan Tannehill at quarterback, who I don't think that Ryan Tannehill is bad as a quarterback in his career. I think that his best years are behind us. I think that he was being wasted a little bit in Miami, and he helped sort of salvage it some, but the identity of that team was Derrick Henry in the rush game, and that was something that we really hadn't seen a running back be the true offensive leader, the number 1 weapon, in some years, and he was helping them utilize that to the max to make an AFC championship game. They ultimately lose to the Chiefs in Mahomes, but if we've learned anything, losing to Mahomes isn't really too much of a true mark against your career resume. I didn't love last year, of course, for the Falcons, but I think that it's a better situation. I got in a little bit of a heated argument with one of my friends yesterday about how Kenny Pickett is the same as Desmond Ridder and the weapons are worse, and that's not going to mean anything. I think that it can't be understated, it can't be overstated, I should say, just how bad the quarterback situation in Atlanta was. Like, if your two options are Ridder and Heineke, and you're juggling those two, you're probably not set up to win anyways. Their weapons are solid, and that sort of takes me into Bijan Robinson here. I also thought that he did not do a very good job of utilizing him, but I think that there was a little more going on behind the scenes, and also, I don't think that that was a good draft pick in the first place for the Falcons, taking him as early as they did, a team that didn't have any real contention expectations. I did not like the decision to take him in the first place. You had a young Tyler Algier. Cordarrelle Patterson was extremely effective the season prior. So I thought that it wasn't quite as easy of a gig as people were making it up to be. And I don't think that he has necessarily the mannerisms and locker room buy-in to be a head coach. But as far as upgrading from Matt Canada last season, I think that they probably did so. And I'm curious to see whether or not he and Kenny Pickett can sort of change the narratives that surround him. But that is all that we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow, same time, 2 o'clock. Just a reminder to like and follow. And we will see you then. Thanks for tuning in.